Tales from the Old Forest. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Chapter 1. A Poisoned River. Imagine a forest, the oldest forest you can. The shape of it, the smell of it, the way the light plays through the canopy, the way it's never quite silent even in its deepest, darkest, most uninhabited recesses. No, you're not quite thinking big enough, I can tell even from here. Let me give you an analogy. It's well established that all libraries are connected. Some quantum trick of the laws of creation allow that all libraries should be, in actual fact, one library. Perhaps it's the fact that knowledge is self-perpetuating and will always seek to join itself to more knowledge, and what could be a greater store of knowledge than a library? Perhaps it's the magic of books themselves, brought to life by the stories they hold, and simply huddling together for warmth. Perhaps it's something we've done with armies of librarians, that priesthood of Dewey decimalization, compiling and archiving books with ruthless efficiency. And the books, such treasured tools of learning, have themselves learned that they should be organized and taken it to its next logical stage. Who can say? The same logic holds true in bookshops as well, at least the really old ones. It will never happen in a chain store or any modern bookshop established later than the Great War. But in the truly old ones, the bookshops that sit hunched in the middle of a crumbling high street quite forgotten, shops where the smell of ancient paper and cracking leather binding bathe your senses as you enter, where books are spread over several floors and the stairs are simply a convenient extra space to store more books. In those bookshops, it's well documented that patrons can take a wrong turn in a shop they entered in Wantage and find themselves exiting a shop in, say, Northumberland or Edinburgh. I'm told this is also the case in museums, perhaps not on the surface levels where the public come and ogle the exhibits, but down in the cavernous storage vaults it's rumoured that they are in fact all one museum, just with several locations. However, that is only rumour, and I can't verify it for certain, so let us stick with cold hard facts. All libraries are connected. So imagine, if you can, the point at which all these libraries intersect, the place where all libraries become, for a brief while, one library. Imagine a bustling hive of book-bound knowledge towering high and stretching wide, lovingly tended by an army of worker librarians relishing the soft silence of the space. That place, that library of libraries, is what the old forest is to the forests that you know. A place so ancient that it defies such petty things as nations and boundaries and simply is. A place where all trees can trace their origins back from time beyond reckoning, and all the creatures that populate the wide world were first brought into being. That is the old forest. Can you picture it? Good. Then I can begin. In the old forest, there are very few humans. It's a sad fact that humans and forests in general are not by nature good companions. They were there long before people arrived with their wild reshaping of what was into what is. No, the blame here rests solely with mankind. We, great brutes that we are, decided all forests were ours for the taking, and for generations we have taken without giving nearly enough back. Because of this, forests and humans do not get on. The old forest remains blessedly untouched by the hands of such an invasive species, but as all forests are connected, and trees are scandalous gossips, word spreads fast, and it's fair to say that the old forest took a general policy of dislike towards humans. However, there are a small number that the forest tolerates, and one such is a relatively new arrival, its newest in fact. His name is Plentyn. Plentyn was aware that his name was unusual, and he didn't enjoy people pointing it out to him. It wasn't his fault, he had not been consulted in the name he was given, very few of us are, but it was his to bear, and so he did it as well as he could. He would have dearly liked to ask his parents about it and try to work out just what they were thinking. But that was just one of a very long list of things he would have liked to ask his parents, and unfortunately none of them were available to him any longer. I am very sorry to have to tell you that Plentyn's parents had died some time ago and left Plentyn quite alone in the world. He couldn't really remember the circumstances around it. In fact, he couldn't remember much of the outside as he thought of it at all. He had some vague recollections, just flashes and snapshots really. A lot of noise, lots of shouting, lots of chaos. He didn't let him think about it often, but when he did, he could remember his mother's hand gripping his tighter than tight, and he remembered running with her towards the tree line. For some reason he couldn't remember her face, but he remembered her long, fox-red hair streaming out behind her, and the chips in her painted nails as she pulled him along, crying out, "Run, Plentyn, run!" Clearly he had not run fast enough, because strong arms had swept him up and carried him, and suddenly they moved faster. Those strong arms and the hot, panicked breath by his ear were the only real memories he had of his father. He had carried Plentyn to the tree line and set him down, and the last words he heard were the same as those from his mother. "Run, Plentyn, run!" Then nothing. Perhaps that was why he bore his unusual name so well. It was one of the few things from his parents that he had left. Now Plentyn lived in the old forest with Grandma. Grandma was not his grandma, you understand. There was no tie of blood or kinship that bound them together, but still she was Grandma. He was aware that she probably had a name of her own, but whenever he asked her, she would simply wink and tell him that she had names enough to fill a barrel or three. Still, between the two of them they had settled on Grandma, and that name had stuck. Plentyn thought it suited her down to the ground. He didn't know how long he'd been alone in the old forest before he came across her, but he remembered their first meeting well. He had heard her before he had seen her. He was alone and cold, following a rough trail beaten through the trees by some creature or other, when he heard a voice calling out among the trees in song. "Oh, know ye not the ancient trunk, the forest vole, the musky skunk?" It was not what you might call a handsome voice, but tired and afraid as he was, Plentyn thought it was the most beautiful sound that he had ever heard, as it rang against the ancient trunks and leafy canopy. He tried to cry out, but his voice was a rough and ragged rasp in his throat. Had he been shouting? He set off running towards the voice, swiping aside clawing branches, tripping over grasping roots. "Oh, know ye not the olden boughs that tower high and scrape yon clouds?" He was desperate that he should find that voice before it was gone and he was left alone again, frighteningly alone. He stumbled and staggered through the net of trees. At some point he lost a shoe, but he didn't even notice. An urgent sobbing was welling up inside him, and he could feel his chest heaving in and out as he thrashed through the brush towards the voice. "Oh, know ye not the hedgehog can never—" The song came to an abrupt halt as Plentyn burst out of the branches, a sweating, sobbing, shaking mess, and saw Grandma for the first time. It was the wrinkles that he remembered best. Plentyn had seen old people before, of course he had, but none who looked quite like this. Grandma's nut-brown skin was crisscrossed with hundreds of wrinkles. Her face was like an ancient map marked with deep valleys and high paths and flowing rivers. The white of her hair hanging like a silver sheet, with the snow-capped mountains and waterfalls on that map, all braided with feathers, leaves, nutshells, small stones and porcupine quills. At the centre of that topographical marvel were the most vivid eyes Plentyn had ever seen. Brilliant emerald green shot through with lavender purple. The old eyes beamed curiously out at him. Plentyn had been so focused on reaching the voice he had not given any thought to what he might do when he found its source. A tired, tearful mess, only now becoming aware that he had one bare foot, he strove within himself to find something he could say. but his voice still seemed to be stubbornly silent, and all that came out was more racking sobs as he stared plaintively at the wrinkled figure before him. Fortunately, the figure seemed to know that no words would follow as she looked at the small, scared boy in front of her. Carved wooden earrings clicked together as she cocked her head to one side, and all the contour lines of her wrinkled skin rearranged around a pure, honest smile. Those brilliant eyes caught the smile perfectly, and Plentyn saw tears well up within them as she stared at him. He didn't know Grandma then, didn't know who she was or what she was to the forest, but somehow he seemed quite certain that she knew everything he would have wished to say far better than he ever could have said it. The gnarled old woman opened her arms wide, and Plentyn's eyes went blurry as he stumbled forward and threw himself into them, utterly spent and weary to his bones. And that was that. He didn't remember anything else from that day, or the several days to follow as he slept and ate and Grandma looked after him. He didn't even remember their first exchange of words, though he supposed there must have been one. But after some time it was clear that Plentyn would stay with Grandma in the old forest. That had all been some time ago. Plentyn always struggled to work out how long, and he was beginning to suspect that time was not quite the same in the old forest as it was anywhere else. Whenever he asked her how long she had lived there, Grandma would never say for certain, and only give him vague questions in response. "Do you know them big rocks? They gathered in a big circle?" she asked him. "Big rocks?" "The big rocks! Huge ones! They place them on top of each other like doorways, and people get all excited about them round the solstice," she clarified. "Stonehenge?" Plentyn asked. "Are you talking about Stonehenge?" "Stonehenge!" she crowed. "That's the one. Yep, I remember him trying to drag a stone through the trees here when they were building it. Made an awful mess. I told him, no, you will go around and find a better route." Of course, Plentyn hadn't believed her when she said that. It was nonsense. She couldn't possibly be that old. But over time, he did start to wonder more and more about Grandma. He had seen her grow a seed into a sapling right in front of his eyes within the time it takes for water to boil. He'd seen her change the way a tree grew, so that a great branch that had pointed north for 100 years was suddenly growing south by the next morning. She swore up and down that she wasn't using magic, but that she knew where magic might be found and how to talk proper to the trees to ask them for a kindly favour. But it wasn't just the trees. One day, she'd spent an hour talking quietly to a river, and the next day it had changed its path around a willow whose roots were being damaged. He was convinced she could speak to all the animals too, but when he asked, she would only snort. "Nonsense," she would say. "Do you hear me clicking and chirping and buzzing and roaring? No. If any of them speaks to me, it's simply because I know how to listen." If he quizzed her on it further, she'd just change the subject and say, "No time for this chittering, there's honest work to be done. You'll learn when you're ready, and no sooner." After a while, Plentyn decided it was best not to wonder too much and just accept that Grandma was different. Gradually, Grandma had shown him around some parts of the forest and introduced him to some of the creatures who lived there. It was strange walking in the forest with Grandma because she was never really walking to somewhere, just walking in general. Occasionally, she'd stop by a tree for a very long time, her hand laid on the trunk, every now and then muttering, "Oh, really?" or "Is that so?" There was never any responding voice that Plentyn could hear, but it did sound for all the world like Grandma was having a conversation with the tree. The same was true with birds, and every now and then one would flit down and land on her shoulder. She would cock her head to one side, her wooden earrings and braided hair clicking softly, and seem to listen. Occasionally she would mutter exclamations like, "Well, I never did," or "Goodness," and then the bird would fly on its way. Plentyn would follow after her, placing his palm on trees like he'd seen her do, but he never heard more than the wind rustling in the leaves, and the birds would do no more for him than chirp or drop the occasional twig and feather. Still, in all, Plentyn had come to view the old forest as his home after a fashion. Though he only knew the small part of it that Grandma had shown him so far, he felt excited about the future he might have there, and each new day seemed to show him something more and more wonderful for him to explore. And yet Plentyn was angry. Really angry. I don't mean to say that Plentyn had a short temper, or that he was impatient with people or unpleasant to be around. I mean Plentyn was angry all the time. It wasn't like a heavy rage or that he was constantly stomping and shouting. It was more like there was a churning level of anger in him at all times. Where other people might be like cool water that gradually has to be brought through warm, hot, simmering, scalding, and eventually reach a roiling boil, Plentyn was always 3 or 4 steps along that journey, and it took very little prompting to push him the rest of the way. In some ways, the old forest was the perfect place for someone like him to be. It's very hard to be brought to a burning anger in a deep and ancient woodland, no matter how prone to it you may be. Oh, a spell of bad weather might ruin your hiking plans, or you may pitch your picnic too close to a nest of industrious ants. But in general, it's extremely hard to be rageful surrounded by deep and mysterious trees and the majesty of nature. Try it, I dare you. Similarly, Plentyn could hold very little anger towards Grandma. No matter how rage-filled you are, it's extremely difficult to be angry with a wizened old woman who has invited you warmly into their home and shown you nothing but love and generosity. That goes doubly when the wizened old woman may in fact be some kind of magic-wielding shaman who's old beyond reckoning and has ancient trees for best friends. Unfortunately, that meant most of Plentyn's anger had only one place it could be directed: squarely at himself. There wasn't much that Plentyn couldn't berate himself for or beat himself up over. He wasn't learning fast enough. He couldn't listen to the animals like Grandma. It was his fault that his parents had... No, he never let himself finish that thought. It was there, though. Always. A splinter stuck below the surface of the skin, red hot and only getting worse. Plentyn wanted the anger gone. Frankly, it was exhausting. You may not be aware of it because most of us experience it in such short bursts, but anger is draining. It uses so much energy and leaves you wrung out and shaking, burned too hot for too long, and you end up burning yourself out. And it was happening to Plentyn day by day. He could feel it. He'd spoken to Grandma about it at length, and the wise old woman had stared those brilliant eyes at him almost like they stared right through him, and taken a deep breath. "There's few cures for anger that can't be learned from the lessons around you, child," she told him. "And in my experience, this forest is a great teacher if you can only mind the lessons." "So I'm too stupid to see it then?" asked Plentyn, a jagged shard of angry heat flaring inside him. "Nay, lad," Grandma replied. "Merely the forest ain't learned your language yet. It's an old forest, and you're a wee whip of a thing, barely grace the earth more than 12 heartbeats. You'll have to forgive the forest for being slow to change." She grinned at him and winked one emerald amethyst eye. "You mark me, lad. This forest'll find a way to teach you before long. Ain't nobody who's coming here that ain't come out different. Tomorrow, we'll go up by the streams to the great river. I always find a goodly walk by a course of water is good for what ails you." So, the next morning, Plentyn and Grandma packed a small bag and set off into the forest towards the streams. As they walked, Plentyn marvelled again at how spry and swift Grandma seemed to be for all her age. Though she walked in fits and starts, pausing from tree to tree, she didn't move slowly. She was like a bird, sweeping from branch to branch. Every moment full of movement was graceful and precise and swift as an arrow. Despite being young and full of beans, as Grandma called it, Plentyn found himself out of breath as he struggled to catch up with her, and he was always grateful when she would stop by some of the older trees for a chat. Eventually, after about an hour of walking, they found the stream that they'd been aiming for and set off along the shady banks. The cool of the waterside air was refreshing, and Grandma finally seemed to notice Plentyn trailing in her wake. Her purple-green eyes sparkled at him as she slowed her pace a little, and she took in a deep breath and began singing one of her walking songs. Plentyn loved her songs, and she seemed to have a never-ending supply of them, all telling stories about different trees, hills, rivers, streams, or creatures in the old forest. When he asked her how she'd collected so many, she'd beamed a smile at him and given a wink. "I speaks for the trees and the creatures what loves 'em," she exclaimed. "They've no voices as normal folk can hear, so I speaks for 'em." There were songs about battles between the animal kingdoms, songs about the spirits of the rivers and streams, songs of quests the creatures had undertaken, and funny songs about unwise animals who'd learned hard lessons. This particular one seemed to be about an ill-tempered beaver who tried to dam the great river itself, and ended up losing a tooth as it gnawed one tree too many. As they walked, Plentyn grinned as he listened to the old woman's warbling voice dancing over the surface of the water. And as the song finished, Plentyn looked around and realized they had reached their destination. The stream they'd been following along had grown bigger and bigger until it reached a join where it met with the great river itself. It was just as well Grandma's song was over, because the sound of the water as it coursed by them was growing louder. No longer a soft babbling brook or singing stream, this was now the basso churning swirl of a deep and mighty river. It wasn't roaring and crashing here, where the rocks were buried deep, but the surface moved fast, and Plentyn could hear the dashing and smashing of water on rocks further downstream, and he knew the smooth dark surface held a strong current. Without speaking, Grandma sat on the riverbank and motioned for him to join her. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the surface of the river and the fish that swirled beneath it. Across the bank, Plentyn saw deer and wildebeest coming to the water, their ears pivoting back and forth as they drank. "It's life, this is," said Grandma, still looking over the water. They'd been sitting in silence for so long that Plentyn almost jumped to hear her voice, but the creatures around them didn't seem the least bit disturbed. "Life?" he asked her. "Aye, lad, it's life, this place. The river feeds all things in its way, and they feed it in return. If you want to understand the health of a place, check its rivers. That will tell you all you need to know." Plentyn didn't quite follow her, but he got the sense that Grandma was building to something, so he stayed silent. "We all have a river inside us, Plentyn," she went on, finally turning to look at him. In this light, the green of her eyes seemed deeper, and the purple was almost blue. "And I reckon that yours has been poisoned." "Poisoned?" asked Plentyn, worry welling up in his voice. "Am I in trouble?" "Of a sort," the woman replied. "Though I don't mean that you've been poisoned, lad. I mean the river inside you has. And that's not good, my boy, because it's not just you it'll touch on." "I don't understand," said Plentyn, a prickle of frustration clawing at him. "What do you mean, I have a river? And what do you mean that it's not just me?" Grandma looked back towards the great river and pointed out one of the creatures drinking on the far side. Plentyn thought it might be a hartebeest, but he was no expert, and he often got them confused. "You see that Sassaby?" said Grandma, confirming to Plentyn that he still had more learning to do. He nodded. "What would happen to it if the great river was poisoned and still it drank?" "I suppose it would get sick," said Plentyn after a moment. "It would at that," agreed Grandma. "And what might happen to a creature that came along to hunt it and eat it? A leopard or a lion or a jaguar, say?" "Well," Plentyn began, "I suppose it might get sick as well." "Indeed it would," Grandma nodded. "And would it keep that illness to itself? Or would it pass it on to its mate, its pride, its cubs?" I suppose it would pass it on," Plentyn agreed. "It would," said Grandma. "'Tain't no suppose about it. I've seen it happen more'n once, and it ain't pretty, I can tell you that for nothing." Plentyn couldn't think of anything to say to that, so he kept silent again. But still there was that prickling frustration in him that there was a lesson here he just wasn't getting. Grandma's voice broke into his thoughts. "When a river is poisoned, the effect runs far and wide, and it poisons everything what comes into contact with it. The consequences are far-reaching and long-lived, and ain't none of them good. You, lad, have a poisoned river in you, and if you let it, that poison will spread to every one you touch." "It's not like I did this deliberately," said Plentyn, the frustration flaring white-hot. "I didn't mean to for my river to get poisoned." "You think that when a river gets poisoned, it's the river's fault?" asked Grandma, a note of incredulity to her voice. "'Tain't no one who can blame the river for being poisoned. No more than an apple can be blamed for being eaten. It's something what's done to them, no blame on their shoulders." "Well, fine," snapped Plentyn, the spark of anger catching light into flame. "So how do I fix it then? You keep telling me it's bad, but you're not telling me what I can do about it." Across the river, the sassaby that had been drinking a few moments before raised its head in alarm and darted for the tree line. Plentyn realized he must have been shouting, and he tried desperately to bank the fire inside him. A plaintive note entered his tone, warring with the anger in his voice. "I don't want to feel like this," he said, looking away. Grandma looked at him, and though he could feel her trying, he found he could not meet her eyes. "Oh, child," she told him, "ain't no cure for a poisoned river other than to quit pouring poison in and let it all drain away. It'll take time is all, and when you're ready, you'll start being able to see new life growing up inside you where the taints have been washed away." "Okay," said Plentyn, still struggling to keep his anger in check. "So how do I stop the poison coming in then, and how can I let it drain out?" "That, I reckon, is why you're here," said Grandma. "No more poison coming in, and a safe place to let it all run out." She meant it as a comfort. Plentyn knew she did, but it felt like a shard of ice had been thrust into his chest. "I know why I'm here," he yelled, not caring about the animals anymore, "and it has nothing to do with being safe." He felt like the whole world was suddenly too close to him, but at the same time everything was far away. His chest was heaving, but he couldn't seem to catch his breath. His skin was prickling all over. His hands were trembling. He couldn't seem to think of any words, or not ones that could make the right shapes for what was swirling around inside him. He was dimly aware that Grandma was staring at him, not angrily or with fear, but her eyes were brimming with tears as she watched his struggle. He had upset her. He had ruined her attempts to help him and her plans for the day. He had hurt her, and now she would leave him just like... He stopped his thoughts. Stopped them dead. Not that one. Never that one. Urgently, he looked around for something else, anything else rather than stare that thought in the face. Whirling, he thumped his hand hard against the branch of a nearby tree that hung out over the river. The shriek was high and made of pure fear. Plentyn's head whipped round, looking for the source of it. He looked to Grandma, but it wasn't a sound she ever could have made. She was far too solid. For all she was a tiny person, she seemed to have roots deeper than an oak. He was just wondering if it might have been him that made the shriek, when he followed Grandma's eyes and saw what she was looking at. On the surface of the great river, a small red shape had surged up and was thrashing wildly, a small red shape that had, moments before, been perched on the branch Plentyn had struck. For a horrible second, the whole world seemed to freeze except for that tiny creature flailing in the water, fighting desperately against the current, a fight it would not win, a fight it could not win. "Plentyn, with me!" Grandma's voice, clear and crisp, brought him to his senses, and he turned to see her herring off down the riverbank, her swift sprint keeping pace with the river current. Running beside her, though, he could see that not even Grandma's prodigious pace could keep up with the river for long. No one could outrun a current like that. Now the poor creature would drown, and it would be all his fault. Looking up desperately, he saw that the river's course bent sharply ahead of them before meandering gently back, and he knew this was their only chance. Sprinting forward, he cut across the curve of the river, taking the only opportunity to get ahead of the current. He could see the tiny red shape in the water speeding towards him. It wasn't thrashing or flailing now. It was a limp thing on the dark surface, its wide, roaming eye the only sign that it was still alive at all. Frantically, Plentyn looked about for a fallen branch or a vine or anything he could hold out for the creature to grab, but nothing was around, and even if there had been, it was clearly too weak to grab hold of anything. Nothing for it, thought Plentyn, as he stepped right up to the edge of the river. "Plentyn!" came a warning shout from behind, but it was already too late. His knees bent beneath him, and Plentyn leapt forward. "Plentyn, no!" Grandma yelled. as he flew towards the obsidian surface of the water, his eyes still fixed on the tiny red mass barreling towards him. He had just enough time to realize how stupid his decision was before the river rushed up to meet him. Thanks for listening. Tales from the Old Forest was a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Adventure is Calling by Vens Adams. Outro music was Conquest of Paradise by Simon Folwar. It was a Parable Arts production.